Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of New Employee Orientation, answering the question, how do we do our work with integrity? In part 1, we talked about how do we get buy-in from employees, how do we get employee commitment, and we talked a lot about how it's important that people have a sense of the identity of our organizations, the purpose of what our organizations do, and then that we give them a sense of belonging by showing them how they fit in to that purpose, to that mission, and those values and beliefs that support the successful accomplishment of that mission. We talked about how in order to do that, we have multi-layered identities that we have to be addressing. Executive branch public service identity, identity at the department and agency level, for those who work in bureaus, agencies, or subcomponents of a department, the identity that is associated with that. And then for certain groups of employees, they have professional identities or specialized work that they do that can also have a deeply important component of identity and purpose that we can draw upon. In answering the question, who are we? Again, answering the question, what we do and what we value and believe, is a way to generate and garner employee commitment. It's a sense of this is the bigger picture, a sense of you belong to something larger than yourself. But now we really have to talk about how do we make this clear to employees? How do we help them see how their day-to-day work needs to be accomplished consistent with the values and beliefs of the overarching organization? And I promised you that I was going to take the example that I showed you of the Forest Service's Employee Handbook, which I think really is a beautiful example of messaging precisely identity, purpose, and belonging, and try to translate that into some materials or some questions that you could use in the conjunction with your new employee orientation to help integrate the ethical principles and concepts into the language and the message and the method of the resource that your organization has already created. So I looked at this particular page of the employee workbook where they actually do that to a certain extent already. They talk about their mission and their motto, and they talk about their purpose. And then they say, to advance our mission and serve our purpose, we balance the short and long-term needs of people and nature by, and then they give some for instances, which are fairly broad brush for instances, of like the types of things that you actually do in the Forest Service, the work that is actually performed. Working in collaboration with communities and partners, delivering world-class science, technology, and land management. So I decided to riff off of that first point, which is working in collaboration with communities and our partners. And this is what I came up with. It's not perfect because I don't work for the Forest Service. So obviously someone in the Forest Service could probably give examples that are much more illustrative and much more detailed, relating to the kind of work that they do on a day-to-day basis. But we start out with a statement that directly references the language in the handbook, which is, in the Forest Service, our collaboration with communities and our partners is a critical part of our care for the land and our service to people. Our reputation among these groups must be one of fairness and impartiality in all that we do. So we're tying concepts, we're tying ethics concepts into the mission, vision, purpose that's already been stated. And then what I've done is I've created two different types of questions. One is an open-ended question. The other is a question with multiple choice answers. Open-ended questions we advocate because we think it's important, particularly with new employees, that you try to get a sensibility about what their understanding is of the concepts that you've been trying to impart. It's important for them to be able to speak in their own way about their own understanding, so that if you need to do a course correction, or if you need to help them better comprehend certain ethical concepts that they've been introduced to and maybe don't completely understand, you know where they're coming from and you know where to steer them toward. Open-ended questions are obviously best suited to live training or training that is going to give people an opportunity to provide you with feedback. We encourage it obviously in one-on-one trainings. We encourage it if you're going to do any kind of even a webinar type of setting. But if that's not possible, then we encourage you in your multiple choice selections to try to replicate what you think you might have gotten from employees if you had asked them the open-ended question. And again, I am not going to suggest that my answers are perfect, but what I will show you is that we ask them not to demonstrate that they understand the technical definitions, legal or otherwise, of what constitutes impartiality. But we ask them to generally identify circumstances or situations that may cause someone to think, that doesn't seem fair. That seems like that might create a problem or illustrate a problem with preferential treatment or lack of impartiality. So the choices that we give people, and we're asking them these actions that we're going to describe, of them, which ones do you think might raise questions about your fairness and impartiality? And then our answers are, and these are just some suggestions, I give some but not all stakeholders advance notice of opportunities or of rulemakings or of policies or whatever the relevant thing is that you might be able to give someone advance notice about. I work most closely with those communities and groups I personally have affiliations with. I don't participate in Forest Service activities or decisions that affect farms or businesses my family members own or work for. So we give them some that are things that they should flag as demonstrating a lack of fairness or a lack of impartiality. And we give them some that they shouldn't flag as, or they should flag as being appropriate. This is just an example of how you can try to translate the materials into meaningful engagements for employees where they can actually see themselves in that decision-making situation. So we ask you to have your questions be mission-focused, but more specifically to be task and job-oriented focused. So make these about your agency. What are the highest risk events that you want to highlight for people coming on board, or this even in the context of your annual training? What are high frequency events? Where are people most likely going to encounter things? What are things that you know most employees new to the agency are likely going to encounter? And then create examples that show how these issues are actually going to arise in their day-to-day work. Now, for those of you who don't have handbooks of the ilk that the Forest Service have created for their employees, and don't honestly have either the time or the desire to craft something that would be not specifically sort of ethics program related, the Office of Government Ethics, we have crafted a handbook for new employees. We have summaries of the standards of conduct. We have summaries of the criminal statutes and, of course, the 14 principles. These are all available on our website. These are all customizable. And we have a guide for customizing each of those that's also available on our website. And that link in that slide is a hot link. So you can go directly to the web page where you can find these materials. For the employee handbook in particular, we have crafted sample pages to show you how, if you wanted to, you could use our materials and customize them to your purposes. There are placeholders for your mission statements, for statements from your leadership, for descriptions about your vision, for explanations of what your commitment is to ethics and what your expectations are of your employees about that. This is certainly a vehicle for you to craft to your own liking, and that will be addressing issues that are your issues and you can make into your own agency's handbook without having to craft it from scratch. In the standards of conduct summaries and in the summaries of the criminal statutes, every section has a set of examples to illustrate the concept that was introduced. These examples are examples that we created that we hoped would resonate with new employees, that we thought had relevance executive branch wide. Here is a perfect opportunity for you to craft examples that are explicitly related to the work that your agency does. That way, when your employees are reading about the concepts, they can then look to the examples and they can see themselves in those examples. And those examples will resonate with them more because they will see it as being directly related to the work that your agency performs. And then, if you want to, you can take some of the examples from those summaries, put them into a PowerPoint slide presentation, and then make reference back to those materials as a way of trying to reinforce where in the materials people can find information and to encourage employees to use those moving forward as resources when they find themselves in situations that are identified in the examples that you've given. Here we try to do something very broadly. We try to identify just generally a situation that can lend itself to a potential conflict of interest or impartiality concern, which is your spouse's employer is somehow affected by the work of our agency. Here we make direct reference back to the summary of the standards of conduct to ask the question and help them answer. Is having your spouse's employer affected by the work of our agency a conflict of interest? And then asking the question, so what is it that you will do? Now that's an open-ended question. You could also translate that out, make it not an open-ended question, but rather craft a multiple choice question. And if you're going to craft a multiple choice question, you might want to make the fact pattern slightly more detailed. But again, in this instance, it's to reflect the concept. And it's not necessarily to ask them to completely understand the legal concept. It's to ask them to identify the circumstance in which it could occur for them. So in this instance, we're talking about the team has been assigned a new grant program to launch. And you know that your spouse's employer is probably going to be eligible and maybe very well will apply for the grant. And then the question is, what actions would you be ethically acceptable for you to take? So we're asking the employee to look at them, and then we tried to come up with examples that we thought were real decision points that the person might actually make. If you had asked them, what are you going to do in an open-ended question, we anticipate some of these answers might very well have been the responses they would have given if the question had been open-ended. So making things mission specific and relevant is important, but we also think that it's important to remember that while not every new employee to your organization is going to be absolutely brand new to government, many people will. And we think it's important that we acknowledge that to folks, that they are entering into a new universe, and that federal public service has some, not only a distinct identity, a distinct purpose and obligations, but that things that may very well have been acceptable in a non-government setting may suddenly now not be any longer acceptable. And that we want to make sure that we highlight those for folks so that they don't feel bad about not recognizing them, and it's simply because in the culture they've come from, these weren't issues at all. So we encourage you, again, to create a question, something similar to what we've done here, which is, that talks about federal public service as a distinct identity with obligations. So we say on your first day of service, you took an oath of office. We all do. Okay, this is your esprit de corps moment. So this is what we chose, and this is what we freely chose. But what does that actually look like in practice? And again, we try to give them some for instances that are things that maybe wouldn't occur to them necessarily as being an inherent part of public service, but that would help them take that concept and make it much more concrete. Similarly, addressing discrete practices that differ between the private and public sectors. Again, no judgment. We're not trying to make a judgment here. We're not trying to say this is bad or this is good. We are simply acknowledging that there are some practices that are quite okay if you're in the private sector and are not okay if you're in government. And some things that occurred to me, you might be familiar with completely different practices that you encounter more in your ethics shop than I'm familiar with. But things that came to me off the top of my head were basically trying to create opportunities. It's a networking sort of thing. The people that you know and the people that you've done business with, you keep an eye out for opportunities. It's a collegiality that in government can get you into trouble. But that doesn't mean that you can't do anything to help out people that you know. So I think giving people a for instance of these kinds of things you can't do to help out people that you know, these kinds of things you can do to help out people that you know, to help them see where the lines are between those things, I think is enormously helpful. Asking subordinates or asking administrative staff to help you do personal tasks, I think that's an issue that typically comes up more for more senior level people who are used to having executive assistants who may have been able to do a variety of tasks for them. So if that's an issue for your agency. Other things that come to mind are not recognizing that you need permission for certain outside activities or employment, or not recognizing that travel has certain processes and procedures that need to be followed before you engage in travel, things like that. But I think it's important for people who are coming in from private entities for you to help draw a map or a blueprint of where they need to be mindful and where there might be some practices that differ significantly between their old employment and their new. Telework-related. We were talking about bringing new employees into a telework-only environment. I think not only for those folks, but frankly for people who are not normally used to teleworking, this is a very difficult adjustment to make because there are some distinct challenges that are just difficult to prepare yourself for or to envision before they actually occur to you. And the examples that I give here are just some of many, but I think some of the big challenges are when you're working at home, what's on duty time and what is off duty time. When you're at home, your personal phone may actually now be also your government phone, but it doesn't cease to be your personal phone. So what are some things that people are likely having happen to them as we speak with respect to just the sheer fact that my personal phone is still my personal phone? And I think acknowledging that and giving people the opportunity to talk about and think about, so what are you going to do when you get a phone call on your personal phone during official duty hours that is from a political candidate or party, when it's from a charitable organization that wants to fundraise, when it's a variety of people who love and care about you checking in and wanting to know about your well-being. I think it's important in these instances to further reinforce for folks what are personal use policies, what is acceptable and unacceptable. So I think incorporating these kinds of things into your new employee orientation is all with a view that Yes, there are ways that we conduct ourselves with integrity. There are mission critical things that we need to do where it's important that we be impartial and fair. But there are just some day-to-day things where we just have to be mindful and we have to be aware where the lines are drawn, and if the agency has preferences or policies or procedures that everyone must follow, that we put people on notice about what those are so that they can fairly follow them. Getting help, I think this is a really important aspect of new employee orientation as well, is helping people identify circumstances when they should be getting help, and then helping them understand from whom. And if we can identify processes, again, procedures, policies, that's all well and good as well. It's a matter of helping people fully understand when and under what circumstances they might be in the dark and they need to not be in the dark. So identifying when and from whom to get help. These are circumstances where we think people find themselves wanting to be helpful or having good intentions, and without knowing what authorities apply to the circumstances that they find themselves in, they may very well inadvertently violate a policy, do what is ostensibly the wrong thing, even though they had the best of intentions. So again, I think if we can help people see situations where it's probably best, until you have a better lay of the land, to get help, to talk to someone. But then I think we have to tell them to whom they may speak. If you don't think it's good for them to just talk to their coworkers, then we should probably say that. If we think that supervisors are the better source of information for them, we should probably tell them that. And if we think there are certain circumstances where the ethics office is truly the only place they should seriously consider coming for advice on a particular issue, we should let them know that as well. I've given you an example here under identifying processes and why. For envisioning this being for groups of people who are most likely maybe to engage in outside employment or activities because of the nature of the professions that they practice. In this question, first of all, we start out by affirming how valuable their expertise is, so that we make them understand exactly how valuable their belonging in our organization is. And then we help them to understand why it is that we require of them a prior approval for some, if not all, of the activities that they might want to engage in. And I've done this in a way that allows them to consider those explanations without giving them necessarily right or wrong answers. And again, you try to anticipate, if you had answered this as an open-ended question, what sort of responses you might have gotten. Finally, I think you should consider maybe having specific or a separate type of orientation for financial disclosure filers. I think financial disclosure filers are an opportunity that is more often than not missed to have one-on-one conversations, to use the filing process itself as an education moment, as the vehicle for your orientation or even for your annual ethics training. It seems to me that it would be quite easy, either while the person is beginning to fill out the form, when you're trying to explain what it is and how they do it, if they come to you with questions while they're filling out the form, or certainly when you're in the review process, or if you've completed the review and you want to explain to them what, if anything, you discovered, that we have an opportunity to explain to people the relationship between the form, the information they're providing, and these concepts we're supposed to be discussing with folks or exposing them to in their new employee orientation, which is conflict of interest, impartiality, misuse, and gifts. We need to explain to people why they're required to file, how that information is relevant that we're asking from them, how is that information relevant to their conduct, to ethics. And then more importantly, I think, what is their responsibility after they file? Because filing is just an instant in time, but their obligations extend beyond that. They have to be constantly monitoring for conflicts of interest, for changes in their financial situation, their spouse's employment, for changes in their work, and then the assignments that they're being asked to fulfill. So I think this is a golden opportunity. And I think if you don't feel like you have the time to build resources or to come up with documentation that would sort of help them better understand the relationship between the form and the concepts, OG actually has done that in a shortened form. This is part of the the confidential financial disclosure session that we did for ethics officials. There are 2 slides, and if you would like to borrow them, if you would like to craft something of your own that is similar to this, where we basically highlighted for reviewing officials the ethics authorities, the ethics issues, the ethics concepts that would likely be implicated in the information that we gather in each of the parts of, at least in this instance, the OG Form 450. We did it for the standards of conduct, and we also did it for the criminal conflict of interest statutes. If you would like to take these and use these, I would encourage you to feel free to do so. But I do strongly encourage you to think of using the filing process itself as an opportunity to fulfill, in a very meaningful way, new employee orientation, or, as I said before, annual ethics training. So again, I would like us all to think that the objective of our new employee orientation should be to help new employees understand who they are in the context of who we are as an agency, as the federal government, as public servants, and that it's really our duty and obligation to help them understand how it is that we expect them to do their work, consistent with the beliefs and values that we espouse, both at the federal level, at the executive branch-wide level, and discreetly within each of our organizations. At the end of the day, I would like you to seriously ask yourself and answer for your agency, what is our Semper Fi?